Lord, you have always been with her. You have been with her family. And Jesus, she has a chance to share these cherished memories of victories, memories of struggles. And Lord, to have her own daughter interviewing her just makes it even more special. Lord, so grateful to have a small audience here for Roland coming to set up so we can share this interview with all of Life Path Church. And Lord, it'll be on YouTube. Anyone in the world can watch it. And Lord, we need to honor history. And Lord, we are so blessed to know this special lady, Lord, who was just a small child in Germany. And Lord, her heart is still the heart of a childlike faith. So Lord, we love her dearly. And we just ask that you bless this interview now. She is in the comfort of her own home, in her garage, where she's been receiving people, with all of Dawn's tools hanging behind her and her daughter in front of her. So I know she feels right at home. So Lord, bless this now. We love you. And we ask just for your wisdom going forward in a situation that has no handbook, but definitely has your word. So our handbook is not changed, and we seek your wisdom in how to move forward, Lord, during these just historic times. And we just ask you to bless this now, Jesus, in your name. Amen.
Amen. I would like to thank you for inviting me to tell you my story about how it was to grow up during Second World War. I am humbled and honored that you give me this chance to talk about it. Thank you.
How did this whole interview thing come up? How did it start?
Yeah, let me tell you how this whole interview thing came up. In 2006, there was an article in the Houston Chronicle, and it was talking about a young man in New York who was always interested in learning about everyday life in America. So he went to the subways and started interviewing people. And at that time, he had 10,000 documented stories already, and they're all stored in Washington in the library. So this article was inviting people in the city of Houston, if they want to interview each other and tell their story, to come to the Museum of Fine Arts, and he would give them a chance to do just that. My daughter Theresa urged me to do this. She wanted to hear my story. And I very reluctantly agreed, because I really didn't think I was capable of doing this. But between her and her dad, they talked me into it, and today I'm very happy that we did. We were talking about growing up during Second World War, but our main focus was about the Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht means night of broken glass. And this was all when Hitler officially started to, and aggressively started, to persecute the Jewish people in Germany. He did not want them living in Germany anymore. So on the 10th of November 1938, he officially again, he started his war against the Jewish people. What prompted him to do it was that there was a young Polish Jewish man, 17 years old, who lived in Paris because he wanted to work there, received a postcard from his sister. And the sister wrote to him that their family was arrested. They were a Jewish family. They were arrested, deported at the border of Poland, and put in a filthy horse stable, and were given just very little food. This young man was so enraged that his family was treated that way that he went to a gun shop, bought a gun, and very calmly went to the embassy and shot a diplomat. So this is all the reason Hitler needed to start Second World War.
So let's start almost at the beginning. What was your name when you were growing up?
My name was Anson, which means Little Anne.
And what year were you born?
I was born November 10th, 1932.
So how old are you now?
87 years old.
Tell us about the town you grew up in.
I grew up in Steinheim on the Main, and the name of the river the town was built on was Main, Steinheim am Main, which is very close to Frankfurt, in the center of Germany. The town was built on a rock, and a big part of this town is still there, and it's over 1,000 years old. It had, at the time when the war started, 5,000 to 6,000 inhabitants. Today it is over 12,000, and it's becoming more of a city than a little town.
Let's talk about your family. Tell me about your dad.
My dad was such a sweet man. He was very sensitive, but also a very good businessman. He was a very caring man. He started out as a lumber salesman, and then he built his own lumber yard from there, and that's what he made his living. He also was a very religious person. He was Roman Catholic. He did not preach Catholicism, but he lived it. He was there for everybody at all times.
And your mom?
And my mom was the same way. Well, my mom was different, but they had this in common. They were both Catholics. She was one of 9 siblings, and between the two of them, they raised our family Catholic, but she was very self-sufficient. She was in charge of taking care of her family and the household, and everybody that needed help.
And your brothers and sister?
I had an older brother. He was 7 years older, Karl-Heinz. And then I had a brother and a sister. They were 3 years older, and they were twins. I was the youngest.
You were raised Catholic?
Yes.
And were most people in your town Catholic?
It was about divided in thirds. There was Protestant, Catholicism, and Jewish people living there. We all lived in a very there was a harmonious atmosphere in this town. Everybody got along very well. No racism. There was no difference between the religions. We all got along.
The war started in 1939. But even before then, you started seeing signs of Jewish persecution.
I frankly, as a child, didn't see it, but I know from my parents that starting in 1939, something bad was going on, but really quite new, but it had to do with Jewish people, because everybody who was not Jewish was forbidden to support Jewish businesses, go to Jewish lawyers or Jewish doctors. If you did, you just disappeared, and nobody knew really what happened. But the SS soldiers would stand guard watching these businesses, and mainly watching the people who were supporting them. So there was a very heavy atmosphere in town, but nobody knew really what was going on.
So tell us about your 6th birthday.
Excuse me. Sorry. When I was 6 years old, it was on the 10th of November in 1938, there was a tradition, an old tradition in my little town, where the birthday child goes to their godmother and they get to pick up their little birthday gift, which I don't even have to say how excited I was to do. But my mother couldn't leave the house to take me because she had to stay home in case somebody would want to buy a piece of lumber. And and my dad was just starting his business. So a neighbor offered to take me, and but my mother and her had quite a conversation. I had no idea what it was about, but this neighbor promised, oh, I will go on the side streets. I will not go to the marketplace. The reason she said this was right around the marketplace was a synagogue, the Protestant church, and the Catholic church. It was right in the center of town. However, when we started out walking, we went directly to the center of town, and all I could see was that the synagogue was in flames. Every window was broken. This is why it happened like this all over Germany, and this is where the name came from, Night of the Broken Glass. The soldiers were standing, throwing all of the Jewish people's, the rabbis' garments in the fire, which was right in front of the synagogue. All their valuable, wonderful books and everything that was precious to them was thrown in the fire. The firemen of the town were surrounding this fire not to protect the synagogue, but to protect the property of non-Jewish people. Everybody was for burning the synagogue. And then in front of the synagogue, there was a hearse, a black hearse, with 4 black horses, and Jewish people tied to it. And they were right in front of the fire, which caused the hearse to run out of town with the Jewish people tied to them. They were driven out of town, and everybody who was Jewish after that. However, nobody knew what happened to these Jewish people, because we did not find out about concentration camps until after the war, after Germany was liberated again. During this night, there were 30,000 Jewish people killed, and 267 synagogues burned. The ones that were not burned that night, they followed within the following week. So when I came home with this neighbor and no birthday gift, I was crying, and my mother wanted to know why, and I told her. And also she was a very forgiving, loving woman. I don't think she ever forgave this neighbor, because all I remember is that they never talked to each other again. And my mother then always found somebody else to get my little birthday gift.
Hitler started requiring all children to go to Hitler youth camps.
Yes, Hitler wanted to have, his goal was to have a pure, blue-eyed, plant nation. And anybody else that interfered with this had to go, which was, of course, the Jewish people. So he started youth camps in every town of the country. And at a very young age, we had to go on Sunday mornings to what we would call today a gym. It was a training program. However, my parents never let us go, and because we went to church, it was at the same time, Sunday mornings at 8 o'clock. And so a few weeks into this, after this order was posted, 2 of the soldiers SS soldiers came to my dad's house and wanted to know, how come your children are not attending this gym? Well, he said, this is at the same time we go to Mass, and my children won't be at 2 places at the same time, so they go to church. Subject was closed, he never heard again, and there were no good or bad consequences because of this.
Oh, Mom. At that same time, Catholic nuns and priests were also starting to be persecuted.
Yes, all Catholic and Jewish schools were closed. The nuns who were in charge of the Catholic schools had to go back home to their towns where they were born and raised, and had to wear civilian clothes. They could not be addressed as nuns or priests anymore. The priests could not wear their habits either. They had to wear suits and ties, and they were monitored every Sunday morning by the Nazis to make sure that the priest did not say anything against the new regime.
Tell us about your family community priest.
Oh, our parish priest was a very personal friend of ours, and so he was at our house every Saturday night, and we had dinner or just snacks, and he was just part of our family. And so when my dad had a business trip to Vienna, he took my mom, and I was allowed to go, and he invited our parish priest, and his name was Herr Pfarrer Törler. Törler was his last name, and Pfarrer was a name for priest, a translation of priest. So before we went, my dad had a very serious conversation with me. He could not impress enough how important it was that I called the priest Herr Törler, which means Mr. Törler, instead of Pfarrer Törler, which meant priest Törler. So I listened to my dad, and we went to Vienna, and at one time we were standing on the side of the street ready to cross it, and my parents and I made it real quickly before the train came, and the priest stood on the other side of the street. So I was very anxious that he's going to join us, and I kept calling Herr Pfarrer Törler, Herr Pfarrer Törler, instead of Mr. Törler. And my dad, I think that was the only time in my life that he spanked me, because if any SS officer would have stood around, he would have been disappeared. He would have gone to the concentration camp. And I don't think I ever called him Priest Törler again. My dad made a very big impression on me.
And he made it through the war?
And he made it through the war.
Describe your house, the house you lived in.
I grew up in a 3-story house my father had it built out of stone. On the 3rd floor, we children had our bedrooms. The 2nd floor, we always rented out. And the main floor was our family living quarters, And the basement was for storage, as like vegetables and fruits and whatever didn't have place upstairs. Interesting it was that during the war, the 2nd floor had to be rented out to a Nazi family, and that was very difficult for my parents because they were so against Nazism.
Your father had the basement remodeled.
The last few years of the war, my dad took a big space in our basement and had all bunk beds put in. Enough for our family and then the people of the 2nd floor. During the alarms, we called it alarms, we all would be, when the raids started coming and the sirens went off, we all grabbed what we could and we ran into the basement and into our bunk beds. Instead of sleeping upstairs, we went down there, and we never slept. My mom had her arms around all of us, and we would just be on the floor praying and singing that the good Lord would protect us and that we wouldn't get in any harm's way. My dad also had a heavy steel door installed, so nothing could happen and nothing ever did happen as far as the bombings go.
But even through that bombing time, you had some joy.
Yes, and I love and admire my parents to this day for this. They let us have a joyful and fun-filled childhood, and and it was serious attacks we had. They gave my brother and I each a little metal box, and when the raid was over and the alarm system went off, we all ran upstairs, and the first thing we looked for was if the schoolhouse burned down. Everything else burned down, but never the schoolhouse. And then my brother and I, we were in a big competition to run around and find splinters of the bombs and wanted to know who had the most. So we did have a lot of fun.
When the bombing raids came, your town went under blackout.
Yes, when the bombing raids came, and from that day on, every night, nobody was allowed to let any light escape from their house. And by that I mean every window, every door had to be taped that no light could come out. If there was an emergency and anyone had to go to the streets, we wore little crane buttons, and it was interesting because if you would have gone on the street, you would have just seen people walking. You couldn't see the people, but you just saw all these little crane lights around town. And it was so dark, and then when many years later I came to America and saw the Christmas lights that American people display in their yards, I just loved all the lights, and I think because of the darkness in Germany, I love Christmas lights.
Your mom was very resourceful during the war.
My mother was very resourceful. She would help anybody. She always had a helping hand. She had two helping hands. She helped anybody who needed help. And during the war, she was forced to, which she didn't really like, but she had to raise pigs and goats and chickens and rabbits, and then they had to slaughter them. It's the reason she got all these animals. My dad would supply people in need with lumber, and they usually were farmers, and so instead of money, which they didn't have, they would give us all these vegetables and fruits and the animals. So then they canned them, and I was very much aware of the can, but I never knew what happened to all the cans. And they never told me because I had been known as being a little blabbermouth, and I would tell people what my parents did. So many times when there were serious conversations, I was sent to another room. But what I found out after the war, that my brother and my mother, they had dug a huge hole behind the lumber yard and buried all the canned and jarred fruits and vegetables and meats. And so at night, when everybody was in bed, they just brought the food, and I would ask my mom, where did all these cans come from? And she would say, oh, you know, the angels, they just put them on the windowsill at night. And I believed it.
There was a big bombing in Hanau, and it changed the course of your dad's business.
Yes. About 2 weeks before the war ended, there was a huge bombing in the city of Hanau, which was just 5 kilometers away from our town. But I have to take you back 1 minute. Before this bombing happened, my dad had a sand wall built around our whole house up to the first floor to protect us in case of a close bombing. Well, 2 weeks before that, the city of Hanau was totally bombed out with firebombs, and the whole town was flattened. And 18 people were killed very close to our house. We were spared because of this sand wall. But nobody was prepared for this mass killing, and so they dug a big hole, the authorities in town, and buried all 18 people in this big hole. My dad was so upset about this that he said everybody should be buried with dignity and grace. And so he had a whole bunch of pine boxes built, and he would give them a free to the relatives of people who got killed during the Second World War within our region. As it happened, a whole casket business developed from that, but that was not his intent. He was just concerned about this merciless burying of people.
Mom, during one of those bombing raids, a bomb fell in your kitchen.
Yes, and again, here goes my resourceful good mom. We were transferred, my husband and our family, we were transferred to Germany for a year. And so Dan wanted to be helpful, and he went to my mother and he said, I'd like to mow your little lawn back there. And she said, okay, but you got to be very careful. She had a grotto back there with a Holy Mary, but she said, there is a well, and you want to be very careful around there. I'm careful, he said. No, she said, you got to pay any attention because there's a bomb down there in the well. Well, how did the bomb get down there? And she told Dan, she never told even my dad, because as you remember, my dad was working in the business and she took care of the household. She said, Dan said to her, tell me about the bomb down there, what happened? And so she told him that there was a bomb in our kitchen during the raids, and when everybody was out of the house, it never exploded. So she just picked it up and carried it through her kitchen, through the entrance hall, 5 steps down, 3 more steps down, clear across the yard and the lawn, and dropped it in the well. And Dan said to her, why didn't you have Michael do this? And she said, Michael runs the business and I run the household and the family. End of story. She was a very brave woman.
Your family had a lot of contact with Nazi soldiers.
Yes, during the war, soldiers were in training camps, and they had to live in small little towns, and there was no room to build barracks for them. So each family had to take one soldier. We were assigned 3 different soldiers at different times, and the first one was a very Nazi-oriented soldier and was very unhappy in our house. And I think it came from both sides. My parents didn't want to hear about this all the time, so they asked could he be exchanged for a different soldier. Well, the second soldier came, and we built a lovely relationship. When the soldiers would stay with us, we children had to leave our bedrooms upstairs, had to give it up. We either had to sleep in the basement or on a couch, wherever, or on the floor, but wherever parents could make room. So this soldier we got, his name was Franzl. He was from South Germany, and I just remember him being such a wonderful person, and during the conversations, my dad asked him one time, he said, what do you want to do when the war's over? And he said, you know, my ambition always was to become a priest and a monk. And I said, why don't you? And he said, I don't have some money, I can't do it. And so my dad said, I take care of it, I pay for it. And so Franzl was not just a family friend, but he went through the seminary, became a priest, and never, ever forgot the generosity my parents extended to him. And I was still young, and he visited us once a month and brought flowers until he was 80 years old and he passed away. It was just a blessing to us. And then the second story was kind of a fun story. It was, his name was also a soldier. His name was Hershipansky, and he was a tailor who was sewing suits for men. Well, my mother had a very, very small kitchen, but he asked her, couldn't she put her sewing machine in the kitchen and he could start a little business on the side on weekends when they didn't have to train. And so my mother, as was just the way she was, she put this big machine in the kitchen, and Hershipansky started his tailoring business. And the suits were only for men, but there was only one lady, and she was very interested in Herr. And to make a long story short, they ended up getting married, and then they had a little girl, and the little girl grew up and used to be your babysitter when we lived in Germany many years later. He also brought my parents flowers every Sunday just to say thank you for taking care of him.
Your brother Karl-Heinz wanted to be a soldier.
My big oldest brother was, his name was Karl-Heinz. He wanted to be a soldier. And was very surprisingly, my dad was not against it, because he said, if you apply to become an officer, you will stay inside an office. You won't have to go on the front line, and there's not a chance to get killed. So he did. He went to officer school. They kept him there. But as things turned out, someday while they were out in the field, my brother felt very adventurous and climbed in a tree. He had a gun pistol in his pocket, and the pistol went off and he shot himself right through the cheek. So he ended up in the hospital, again away from the front line. But as the war progressed and ended, he became a prisoner of war. So my parents got a letter that he was missing. Nobody knew what happened to him. And before my parents got this letter, my mother was always walking around the house singing. She's just a happy singer. And the day that letter arrived that my brother was missing, she stopped singing. She never sang again. In those days, when we got our mail, a mail lady would walk the streets, and we would stand at the gate and wait for our mail every day. And my mother was so distraught that she made this mail lady a promise. What I have to tell you first is that we were all rationed, we were on food stamps, and my mother only would be allowed to have 1 pound of coffee a month. But she loved her cup of coffee in the morning, so she really had to ration it. But when she was so distraught about my missing brother, she did not only sing anymore, but she told the mail lady, she said, I make you a promise. If you ever come and bring me a notification that Karl-Heinz, that they found him, I give you a whole pound of coffee. And that was huge. That was a big sacrifice for her. She hid it from herself up on the 3rd floor so she wouldn't be tempted to sneak herself a cup of coffee. So one morning when I was standing with service at the gates, a mail lady came and she just was waving a letter, and she came and my mother opened the letter, and they had found my brother at the Sahara Desert. And my mother looked at me and she said, go and get a pound of coffee. And she gave us a pound of coffee, which was just a huge sacrifice for her, but she happily did so.
And Karl-Heinz ended up getting home safely.
And he came home a year later. So he was at Sahara Desert and then in England, and he came home a year later.
Your other brother, Rudolph, also wanted to be a soldier.
Oh, my other brother, Rudolph, was 15 years old, and he was going to win the war. He was absolutely ready to go. And, 2 weeks before the war, Hitler created the Westwall, which means the West Wall, and he called every male between the age of 15 and 70 to report to the west part of Germany and make a human wall fighting the Allies, England and France, America, determined to win the war. But so was my brother, 15 years old. He grabbed his bike, ready to go, and my parents were told, no, you can't go. Well, he took the bike and left. So my dad, who was a very honest man, he had never delivered lumber to the Nazis, but he went to the local government and said, if you ever want me to deliver lumber to your cause, I need help. I can't do it by myself. I need my son back. So they called him back, and my brother was so upset and so furious that he couldn't fight the war that he didn't talk to my dad for 3 weeks, and that's when the war ended.
There was a big bombing in Offenbach.
Offenbach is a city 12 kilometers away from my town, and there was a big bombing on the 19th of March in 1944, almost at the end of the war. And my dad's lumberyard was located in Offenbach. When we came out of the basement, when the alarm system went off, my parents looked at the sky and they could see the red sky in that direction, and he told my brother, get on your bicycle and check out if the lumberyard is still standing. My brother Rudolf left and he came back 6 hours and he said, Papa, the whole lumberyard is flat, everything is gone, nothing left. And my dad looked at my mom and he said, God gave it and God took it, praise the Lord. Where's my bicycle? And he took his bicycle and took off, and he came back that night. It was dark already. He was gone 6 or 7 hours and had borrowed some paper and pencil, and that very day started his business again. He was a man of determination and faith in God that he would help him.
Turns out, though, as a result of that Offenbach bombing, you found out what a small world it really is.
Yes, it really is a small world. I grew up, I met Don, my husband, and we lived in Michigan, Pontiac, Michigan, and he went to work, and one night we invited one of his colleagues and his wives for dinner. My sister from Germany was visiting at the same time, and we had a very pleasant evening, and the conversation turned around to the Second World War, as it often did. Mac asked my sister, what was the date when this lumberyard burned down? And she said, the 19th of March, 1944. And he questioned her, how do you remember this date so well? And she said, it was St. Joseph's Day. I will never forget it. And Max said, I bombed your dad out. I was in charge of this raid. And he absolutely was devastated. He was so upset. But Don and my sister and myself, we just assured him he was just following orders. It didn't have anything to do with him personally, nor with my parents. But that really taught us how small the world is.
Your dad, Oppo, was against the war, and it almost cost him his life.
Yes, it almost cost him his life. And as I mentioned before, nobody knew about concentration camps, and I had told you the story how he was questioned about not sending us children to the gym. Again, a few weeks later, 2 SS officers came and wanted to know why he doesn't change his name. His name was Michael. You have to change your name. And my dad said, I won't change my name. Why do I want to change my name? It's a Catholic name, you need to change it. This is out of the question. I was baptized with his name, and I will never change it. The officers left, and again there were no consequences of this conversation. And a few weeks later they came again and asked him. He had his own office in Offenbach, in that city, and he had 7 small offices in one building. And each office had a crucifix in it, hanging on the wall. They came to him, he had to take the crucifixes down. Well, I'm not going to take the crucifixes down, this is my office. And again, quietly they left. They just shook their shoulders and nothing happened. After the war, 2 weeks after the war, a dear friend of my dad, who was well informed about Nazism, told my dad, he said, Michael, you don't know how fortunate you were. What did I? Yes, I was fortunate. I survived the war. No, he said, you survived the concentration camp. 1 more week, if the war would have lasted 1 more week, you were on the list to be deported to a concentration camp because you didn't change your name, you didn't take the crosses out, and you didn't send your children to the training. So God again, my dad again was ever so thankful to God.
When was the first time you actually heard about concentration camps?
The first time I heard about concentration camps after the war, Polish refugees came through our town on horse-drawn wagons. They were all very hungry. And I remember we children stood out on the street with buckets of apples and buckets of potatoes and loaves of bread and gave it to them. And I remember while I was handing it out with my sister, a friend of my parents came and she said, Ensign, run in the house and tell your mom and dad that Uncle George is out of the concentration camp. He survived. And I said, what is a concentration camp? And she said, just go and tell your parents, they know. And I went in and I said, Uncle George is out of the concentration camp, very unconcerned. And they said, what is a concentration camp? Which really shows that the public did not know about concentration camps. And then we found out later that he survived.
After liberation, you started coming in contact with American soldiers.
Yes, one day it was announced very, very happily, the war's over, the GIs are coming, and we all went to the main street, and our castle tower was on this side of the town, and the Nazis stood up there with with a Nazi flag. We are going to win the war, we're going to win the war. But this side of the town, we all stood with white sheets, which was a sign of, we're giving up, come on in. And the GIs would sit up on their tall tanks and say, we were waving, and it was just a wonderful, wonderful day. And they threw us powdered eggs and powdered milk, and of the best things of all, white bread and peanut butter. We never had peanut butter, and they brought us all this food while the Nazis were still trying to win the war, but then they were arrested and we were free. And if I may add to this, in all our happiness, it was the first time we saw black soldiers, because we thought they only live in Africa, and it was a wonderful, wonderful sight to see all black and white people united. It was wonderful.
Now, not all your experiences with American soldiers were good.
Oh yes, so after the war, after we were liberated, there was also a new rule that nobody could lock their houses day or night. We had to, everything was open for the soldiers. And the soldiers, as the German soldiers did in Paris and in France, took advantage of it. They would roam the streets in their free time and literally just walk in a house and took what they wanted to, jewelry, silverware, paintings, whatever they liked. And also, especially at night, the soldiers would walk the street looking for girls. My family, again, had a tradition that every Saturday night the priest would come and we would sit out in the backyard enjoying a glass of wine and snacks, or sometimes dinner. And my sister and I, we were just running around having fun. Now we were very young. I was only 12 years old. My sister was 15. And The soldiers would walk by the street, and we didn't think anything of it, but my parents did, because they knew what was going on. So the next Saturday, my parents did not let us go in the yard. We had to go upstairs on the third floor and stay up there, stay in bed. So the soldiers came again, and they spoke a little German, and they said, "Where are the girls? Where are the girls?" And my dad, surprisingly to everybody, said, "They're upstairs in the bedroom. We want to see the girls, but let me show you where the girls are." I think my mother was speechless, and so was the priest, but my dad took these 3 soldiers and went in the house and took them to the basement. He said, "Before you go upstairs to the girls, I want you to really enjoy and have a good evening. I want you to be some evenings that you will never forget." And he took them in the basement, and he had a beautiful wine cellar down there. So he opened some wine bottles, and he got these 3 guys so drunk that they couldn't even walk anymore. And so he took one at a time in a wheelbarrow back to the barracks. And nothing happened. Of course, he knew exactly what he was doing. But the next morning, it was also at a time where German men would not wear jewelry other than a wedding band. Nobody would wear a cross. One of the soldiers came back, and he had this beautiful silver cross, and he came to my dad and my mother, and in his broken English he said, "My mother gave this cross to me to protect me, and I'm so sorry about what we had planned to do last night. I want to give you this cross because I want to apologize and thank you for preventing me from whatever I had planned to do." And my mother would be devastated if she would know my intentions. So he gave his cross to my dad, and against all tradition, he wore it until the last day he passed away. And then he passed it on to one of my nephews.
What did you learn from the war?
I learned from the war, from doing the war, to always have a helping hand to anybody who needs it. Because my parents would literally take strangers in the house, and many mornings we woke up and somebody was sleeping on the bench, or somebody was sitting at the table who was hungry, and it was just natural for us children to live that way. Strangers or friends who would come to us, my mother always sent them back with a heart filled with love and full tummy. I also learned to be very empathetic and not stand in judgment of people. And I hope that my husband and I transplanted that to our children, and always have an open heart, an open door, and a helping hand.
Can you talk about the sign that was always in your father's office?
This is a writing my dad. He wrote it on Christmas Eve in 1960, and it really explains the philosophy of his life. I read it in German first and then translate it in English. Das Leben besteht nicht in erfüllten Wünschen, sondern in erfüllten Pflichten. He wrote it in Christmas 1960, and it translates to life does not consist of fulfilled wishes, but of fulfilled obligations. Our children all have a copy of this, and I think they're living by this also. And I want to thank you very much for listening to my story. would you build me this? And he said, yeah. So when I got my angel, then you built, isn't it beautiful? How everything looked in 1776, and it's still standing today. This is exactly how it looked, and it's still standing today. And see that wall around it, that was around the town.